What would you say is the most common misconception business leaders have about decarbonization, and kind of what's the hard truth that you have to tell them about where they really stand when you start working with them?
What that process of coming up with the strategy entails, it's
Today's guest is David Jaber, founder of Climate Positive Consulting. With over 20 years of experience helping more than 200 organizations decarbonize, David is a leading expert in turning climate goals into real business results.
Do you have any thoughts on remote organizations and maybe some of the emissions that they are putting out and things they can be mindful of?
there are some calculators you can use to come up with sort of a rough sense of your footprints. They would typically do some sort of spend-based analysis. So basically you tell it how much did we spend on all these different areas. It would make an estimate based on some databases, what sort of the footprint of that is. I think you certainly can be judicious about if and where you use like ChatGPT, for example, because a lot of people have sort of replaced their Google search with ChatGPT, which has 10 times the footprint. Then you have to start to ask, do I really need ChatGPT for this situation, or will other things suffice?
Something I'm seeing with some clients is that they want to make climate commitments, but they're terrified of being called performative or getting it wrong. So can you talk about how you help clients navigate the pressure to be perfect while also making genuine, measurable progress?
I think I want to say first,
Welcome to the Purpose Profit Shift, where real stories about bold shifts illuminate how we can create a new economy. I'm your host, Rachel Bernier Green, social entrepreneur, activist, and founder of EJ Consortium, a finance consulting firm designed to help purposeful businesses change the world. Today's guest is David Jaber, a business advisor who has spent 2 decades demonstrating that climate action and business success aren't opposing forces, they're strategic partners. David is the author of Climate Positive Business: How You and Your Company Hit Bold Climate Goals and Go Net Zero. He's worked with over 100 companies on carbon footprint analysis and greenhouse gas reduction. As an instructor at UC Berkeley and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and founder of Climate Positive, a certified B Corporation committed to the Net Zero by 2030 challenge, David brings both an academic rigor and hands-on implementation expertise. If you've ever wondered how to turn your company's environmental commitments into measurable, profitable action, this conversation is for you. David, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course. So every episode, as you know, we spotlight the moment when a leader chose purpose over convention, even when it felt risky. So your decision to build Climate Positive as a B Corp with a public net zero commitment, that's exactly the kind of courage our audience needs to see modeled, because you're not just advising from the sidelines, you're actually in the arena with them. So I know you started with a background in chemical and environmental engineering, but can you tell me more about the moment that you realized that we, as a society, really weren't adequately addressing climate challenges, and what made you decide to build Climate Positive?
That is correct. That's where I started, and that change actually developed over some years. So just bear with me on a little history.
Absolutely.
In college, as I was pursuing a chemical engineering degree, what I discovered, and I think like a lot of us discover in colleges, can just kind of find our purpose. What I discovered is that environment was my real passion and what I was motivated to work on. So then for a master's degree, I finished up bachelor's for chemical. I pivoted to environmental engineering. And in environmental engineering, as what you get trained to do, I think probably many people maybe aren't aware, or at least what we were trained to do at the time, is clean up pollution, whether that's in air, water, or on land. And as you get into trying to implement and move forward solutions, at least what I was seeing is a lot of intractable problems. So you spill chemicals on dirt, how do you clean dirt? Sort of the question. And so you see these systems operating or trying for years to try to get sites clean enough for people to actually kind of live and interact with them. So just seeing some of those problems gave me this genius idea that maybe we shouldn't pollute in the first place. And at the time, as I was kind of looking around after having this realization, there was this emerging concept. Some were calling it sustainability. Some were calling it green business. Some were calling it pollution prevention. But it all revolved around this idea that we can run businesses better and essentially find ways to prosper while kind of maintaining the health of life on the planet, whether that's your local ecosystem or it's thinking more broadly. So that really helped me shift my focus. And I ended up landing a position at a sustainability consulting firm. And this was a time when that industry is quite nascent. I think now people hear about kind of sustainability and climate specifically a lot more. But back in the day, there just was not a lot of activity. And so in sustainability consultants, climate is a portion of that, but that's not the only component that I think you've probably seen if you see ESG consulting now, and people are working on an array of, water, biodiversity, whatever the issues are. So I was at this firm. I was able to build skills there for several years, and that provided the basis for me to launch my own firm. I do think I need to maybe call out that, so at this point, I had left this firm. I freely admit there was not this grandiose vision around starting a consulting firm. I
I
intentionally.
don't think there ever is. Or
I'm glad.
rarely. I think we kind of romanticize that idea.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. I think sometimes, especially if you see like founder pitches, it's like, well, here's this clear 5-year plan and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. But yeah, anecdotally, I think that's what I also hear people saying more of. So I did intentionally leave this previous firm, and I took time to work on some side projects. When I was ready to re-enter the workforce, while I was applying for jobs, I had also had some side consulting work. And so I worked on that in parallel. And after a month, I had 4 consulting projects. And that made me realize, hey, maybe this could actually work as a firm. And so, fast forward, probably some 15 years. The purpose now for Climate Positive, because I think you were asking about, what made you decide to build, is to shift and by our, I just kind of society writ large, our emissions trajectory to help address climate challenges. And we work with a key sector, businesses. Businesses both have this outsized impact on climate if you look at the numbers, but also I think what a lot of us like about businesses is there's kind of this capacity to move quickly, right?
Yeah.
It's honestly one of the superpowers of the private sector. And so I see businesses as a key leverage point. And, that's kind of why that's our focus.
I love that. That's one of the things that I always tell people is that when we think about tools for social or environmental change, that businesses, for-profit businesses, I know we often think about the government and nonprofits, but for-profit businesses, because of that agility that you just mentioned, are one of our most powerful tools for enacting change in those areas, because businesses can wreak catastrophic havoc. But on the other hand, they can do the exact opposite and profitably.
Exactly.
So I know you have worked with many companies, over 100 companies at this point. What would you say is the most common misconception business leaders have about decarbonization or about your work as a whole? And kind of what's the hard truth that you have to tell them about where they really stand when you start working with them?
In our work, I maybe didn't preface that earlier. So we do support companies on decarbonization strategy, other companies. And just to break that down further, decarbonization strategy, you can also think of as carbon emissions reduction strategy, but it's really taking responsibility for all these activities in your operations and value chain that are generating the greenhouse gas emissions that affect the climate. So what that process of, coming up with the strategy entails, it's first measuring business emissions so you can see where the major hotspots are. The second part of that typically is setting meaningful emissions reduction targets and creating plans to actually hit that target. So that's basically helping them bridge, where they are to where they want to be. And then once they've set a target, again, sort of like finalizing that plan or that strategy. And so there's a standard for these emission targets that are called science-based targets, if you've heard that term.
Yeah.
And we can get into a lot of detail about that if you want, but you can essentially think of those as
Maybe
ambitious.
just an overview for listeners who aren't
Sure.
familiar with the term.
Sure. They're ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. The genesis of science-based targets, or SBTs, as most of us in the industry call them, was in the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. where countries agreed to dramatically reduce kind of their own emissions. So science-based targets are looking at the climate science and looking at this commitment and have figured out how much we need to reduce emissions in our businesses. So there's the deadline for those targets currently is typically 2030. Because these are ambitious targets, you're asked to do a lot this decade to bring down emissions. So you had asked about sort of a misconception that leaders have. To me, it's less of a misconception, but maybe more of a mindset shift around embracing the target. So what typically happens when you're crafting this strategy is that in 2025, you won't have a complete line of sight to what you need to do over the next 5 or 10 years to hit that target. So the approach we generally advise companies to take is do this analysis and come up with a portfolio of actions that illustrate to you that you can make a reasonable amount of progress toward the target, but you're generally not going to see that you're going to make it all the way to the target. So the other part of this mindset is just embracing the fact that this is a goal you need to set because the society and our best understanding of the living systems on the planet need you to set it.
Right.
And take that leap of faith that, okay, your commitment will help you figure things out over the next future years. And you're with this cohort of peers that is trying to do the same thing. There are 11,000 companies now that have signed up to science-based targets. And a lot of these are large multinationals where everyone in their supply chain, and for some large companies, that could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies, are also being sort of pulled into the sphere of kind of science-based targets and ambitious climate action.
That is by far the best news I've heard all day.
Sometimes it's hard to come up with good news in this field, but I'm happy to provide some where I can.
And I love this idea of, talking about the mindset shift that you can have all of your steps planned out and those steps might not take you all the way there, but that doesn't mean that that's a reason not to start, that we can kind of let go of this all or nothing approach, because I think that there's kind of a fatalism that has developed for a lot of people where it just feels like this is too big of an issue. We can never solve it. And so then they do nothing, which clearly doesn't get us any further. So I love that you take that approach with your clients.
Yeah, there's fatalism, and then there's also kind of this almost philosophy around targets, like whether you set targets you can hit versus targets you need to hit, even though you don't completely know how to get there. So science-based targets are definitely asking you to do those stretch goals and get into places where you might be a little uncomfortable.
That is, and that is huge. And that in all of humankind, when we're in those situations and stretching in that way, that tends to be where, the biggest innovations that we make happen because we put ourselves in those positions to go after those stretch goals instead of the things that we know that we can comfortably hit.
Those are the places in living systems, I guess, where you evolve.
Right.
You have certain pressures, so you just figure out how to get things done. And I think that's applicable to kind of human organizations too.
Oh, very much so. That's definitely a gem. So one of the things that I would love to talk about is because a lot of our listeners, they have some social or environmental reason that they are in business, but that they are trying to often articulate both internally and externally how those activities kind of translate into a strategic advantage, which is something that you've been able to do, is to teach companies how taking these measures isn't just something that is a feel-good thing, that there are also some, positive advantages to their business. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the surprising strategic advantages that companies have been able to uncover by pursuing decarbonization strategies?
That's a great question where I think a lot of people are looking to find sort of more breakthroughs.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely very, very valid. Would you say that you perhaps have seen some, or is that kind of a joint journey that we're kind of all on? It's figuring out where decarbonization also delivers other strategic advantages in business.
Rather than think about this as, I guess you could think of this as sort of a strategic advantage. I think what I would say is sort of the driver for companies kind of engaging this typically is to satisfy stakeholders. So the number one reason that I've seen over time why companies kind of engage in climate action is customer demands. So particularly if you're a B2B or business to business customer, some major customer asks you to create a plan or to report your emissions to them. And that customer represents maybe 10%, maybe 30% of your business. So you say, of course, I'm going to do that because I want to keep goodwill with this major customer that's making requests. That said, I think there are other stakeholders that have been critical here. We've seen an escalation of climate activity, I would say, over the past 6 to 8 years.
Yeah.
And in my view, that's actually due to the investor community and the rise of ESG. So it's like environment, social governance, sort of a triple bottom line sort of thought process that really, kind of took off with investors in the financial community. So with the rise of that kind of around 6 to 8 years ago, investors have at least signaled that they care about the environmental and social responsibility of their investments. And that has drawn attention in a very different way from boards of directors and company leadership to respond to these requests than, say, if it's just Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund asking you to do something, nice for the planet. It's the people with the purse strings have sort of been messaging this. You could probably trace back sort of multiple factors that had sort of driven a lot of the climate and sustainability activity. But what I would say is as someone who's been in this for a long time, like 20, over 20 years at this point, that the amount of activity has been really impressive kind of the last 6 to 8. It's certainly, we've seen a dramatic escalation in our business. I know peers that have found the same.
Yeah, I think that is definitely imperative that there is a lot of consumer demand driving this. I know even with our 401k, for example, at our business, we intentionally selected a provider because they had certain funds that were aligned with our values. And the fact that consumers can make choices like that, money talks and can help drive decisions. I know I have heard some kind of going back to the strategic advantage thing. One anecdote I heard was about a company who realized that the packaging that they were using, that there was a lot of excess space in the packaging, and so they switched to a different type of packaging, which then became more efficient to ship. So it was more effective from carbon production standpoint, and they also saved money because the packaging was smaller, and that was kind of a way where it was an unanticipated win where they weren't expecting to get that kind of positive impact to their bottom line because they were attempting to do something that was more environmentally sustainable, and it led them to a win-win decision.
Yeah, you can certainly find efficiency or process changes that do that. Whereas sometimes the investigating footprint for sort of one client, they noted some of the processes were using extra energy, but then also were like creating more defects. So kind of addressing that and trying to sort of phase out that helped them. This same client also there was like sort of this cooling process where they had like multiple companies, and turns out one of the factories was using this cooling process, the other one didn't need it, and they were producing some of the same product. So they're sort of starting to question, it's like, okay, so why we had the standard operating procedure to do this, but it doesn't look like we need it. And so that the investigation that drives frequently sort of comes up with these solutions, like you're saying, that can have a multiplicity of benefits and more strategic advantage.
That is really awesome that people are able to find things that way. When you are, out there conducting a carbon footprint analysis, are there any significant kind of hidden sources of emissions that founders don't expect, and they're surprised that there is an area where they are maybe scoring worse than they anticipated?
I don't know that those we work with necessarily have expectations.
That's fair.
I mean, it used to be the companies were focused on their own operations, and that's partly because of the rule set and the sort of less ambitious goals that companies were setting. And by their own operations, you think about their facilities and the fleets of vehicles they might be operating. It's pretty well known now that most of the emissions for most companies fall in their supply chain. So engaging suppliers around their own strategies then becomes kind of this key action that they need to take on. So they're asking questions about suppliers, like, whether they have climate targets and what their emission numbers are and what sort of projects they've initiated for energy efficiency, renewable energy, recycled content packaging, and some of the other recommendations that sort of, typically come up. It could be things they've already identified in their own operations that they now want their supply chain to take on to.
Got it. And as you were speaking about that, especially the piece about clients not necessarily having expectations, I feel that I would fall into that bucket, that if I were to undergo this process, I would have no idea how we score. I know that we are, a primarily remote organization. And even when I think about the tools that we use, I know that our use of certain tools has different environmental aspects, but I wouldn't even know where to start in terms of tracking or what kind of sources of emissions remote only companies are generating to even initiate that process. And I know that there are probably a lot of the founders that are listening that are in similar spots now where they are operating remote firms. And there were initiatives back when I was in corporate where there were things that we could do because we were gathered in a single place that perhaps don't make sense to do when we're scattered. But do you have any thoughts on remote organizations and maybe some of the emissions that they are putting out and things they can be mindful of?
There are some calculators you can use to come up with sort of a rough
Love
sense of your
calculators.
footprint. There's plenty of them out there if you look. I think what they won't have necessarily, I think that you're kind of getting into, and this has just been over the last 2 to 3 years, that the emergence of AI has kind of been a concern around emissions, right? There have been people that have been trying to avoid it, but now AI is kind of embedded in all of the tools that we use.
All of our tools.
Yes. So it's somewhat unavoidable. Those calculators, though, generally wouldn't necessarily have enough granularity to break down. So typically these calculators, if they do what we call sort of scope 3, which would be kind of looking at your supply chain, they would typically do some sort of spend-based analysis. So basically you tell it how much did we spend in all these different areas, and it would make an estimate based on some databases, what sort of the footprint of that is. For most of us who are service-oriented, business travel is going to be like once you step onto a plane,
Yeah.
aren't really any great alternatives for air travel. And this is actually appropriate to our own business too, because, we've also kind of set our own sort of climate target. So being judicious about that travel will almost certainly dwarf your computer footprint of like online tools that you're using.
Yeah.
I think you certainly can be, judicious about, if and where you use like ChatGPT, for example, because a lot of people have sort of replaced their Google search with ChatGPT,
Yeah.
which has 10 times the footprint. And you have to start to ask, well, how do I really need ChatGPT for this situation? Or
Right.
will other things suffice? So it's a lot of discernment, but I think for those of us who are services, it's going to be both business travel, and then the second category I would look at are the things you purchase. So, and without, especially assuming we're talking about sort of smaller companies that don't necessarily have the resources to hire consultants like us, I think what you can do is just look at where you're spending your money and be, have standards around your suppliers, Or do they say things that they're renewably powered or other efficiency? Do they have fair trade or other responsible kind of sourced certifications for the things that I'm buying? Am I buying locally? So at least I know that I'm not having things flown halfway across the globe to me, but they're coming more local. So I think those are the sorts of things that I would probably look at to start. And I think those who go to climatepositiveconsulting.com, find our contact form. If you have questions about this, you're welcome to submit there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we will also find some of those calculators and include them in the show notes so that people that aren't in a position. But to that point, I would love to clarify, can you talk about size businesses that you do work with, what kind of the range is?
So the companies that come to us, I would fall into what I would tend to call sort of a medium-sized range.
Okay.
So maybe 5 million to 5 billion in revenue. The rationale there is not that we're having these explicit limits saying, well, we're not going to work with you because you're that small or you're too big. But it's small companies just generally aren't going to have the budget to sort of hire consultants. Larger companies will frequently could have multiple staff on hand to do this type of work. I think where it seems like we're kind of most helpful is for companies that maybe have a sustainability director or sustainability department. So they have some focus and kind of know that they want to kind of take action, but they don't have enough resources to get there. And they're maybe just sort of starting on the path. So it makes sense for them to get sort of advisory help. And frequently these are product companies, but also some services. So like we're in a lot of food processing, outdoor goods, other consumer packaged goods. We've also had more work in sort of the financial services area, which has been interesting because then it's
Yeah.
kind of a whole different process and set of priorities that you have.
Very much so. Thank you for sharing that. And that the reason that I ask is because while we have some listeners who are going to fall in that range, and for the smaller listeners, one of the things that we always love to do with our clients is when we do like annual budgeting processes, instead of just doing okay, this is where we're looking for the next, 1 year or two, we kind of do a vision boarding exercise that we wrap into budgeting. So then people know what they're trying to grow to, so that they have, the org chart in mind and the list of advisors in mind that 5 years out, that this is what they are working toward. And so it's really helpful for people to get an idea of the resources that are available out there, or even the idea that they, may want to have someone in a sustainability role within their organization in their org chart of the future. So we see that on both sides.
Yeah, that visioning process can be, really helpful because there's something you can't do this year, but at least getting some forward kind of looking ambitions. Like, well, we can't do this now, but maybe in 3 or 5 years, we want to be at the place that we can do that. I think that's like with these plans I was talking about. It's a very similar process.
Yes. Very much so. So one of the things that I actually had someone flag for me when I let them know that I was going to be talking to someone with your background is they wanted to talk about how right now there is massive, does not feel like a large enough word, but skepticism about corporate climate commitments because greenwashing is everywhere. And so something I'm seeing with some clients is that they want to make climate commitments, but they're terrified of being called performative or getting it wrong, especially if they're using these commitments in like some of our larger clients and, maybe in government contracting or things of that nature. So they want to make sure that there's actually some teeth to what they're doing. And so you understand both the science of this and also the communications challenge that can kind of come along with it, how to be transparent about the journey without getting, paralyzed by perfectionism. So can you talk about how you help clients navigate the pressure to be perfect while also making genuine, measurable progress?
Those are certainly legitimate concerns. Like you said, it's more than massive, and there are companies are needing to grapple with that. I think I want to say first, just because we do hear a lot about calls about greenwashing. So we generally don't use the term greenwashing. And for one, it suggests there's kind of this bright line between companies intentionally not taking action or misleading the public and companies that are 100% bona fide in their actions.
Mm.
But more important than that, I'm not really interested in judging whether or not a strategy is greenwashing or not. What I am interested in is amplifying the parts that are working and calling out the parts that aren't. So we can simultaneously laud Microsoft as an example of a company that's been leading some very deep and impactful climate work around, say, carbon removal projects and supply chain decarbonization. At the same time, we can call them out to say, "Hey, AI is increasing the footprints of your operations. What are you doing about that since you have this goal?" Or why are you a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? And I don't know if that's still accurate, but I think it was at one point because that chamber routinely opposes climate legislation. And that would seem to be at odds with your goal.
Right.
I think there's this complexity in my experience around businesses where sustainability staff are genuinely trying to move things forward, and you might have government relations or other folks, advocating against the things the sustainability people are trying to advance. So that, there's systems. I think one way companies can sort of navigate that is look to sort of like credible standards and sort of third-party commitments. Like a science-based target is sort of the gold standard. So if you set a
Mhm.
science-based target, that's been vetted and worked on to where people should not be calling you out for having that. They could call out your actions if they don't seem appropriate to this now ambitious goal. So that I guess maybe it sort of adds part of a challenge too. But I think so. I think there are sort of these third party standards. I think the other thing is just, keeping an eye on what stakeholders are talking about in terms of greenwashing, like what are the real concerns. And ultimately transparency is kind of the mantra, I think, in a lot of this. It's like, make a claim. If there's some question sort of behind it, be transparent. It's like because you can say, "Hey, this is what we came up with. Here were our assumptions behind it." You can take issue with the assumptions, but what I don't want you to take issue is the pathway after that we took to like come to this conclusion. Because I think that just that helps build trust, and I think if you have trust,
Yes.
that can really bridge kind of this greenwashing concern that is typically alleged against companies that don't really have a lot of trust with whoever the stakeholder is.
I absolutely love that answer because it really kind of gets into the nuance and also into a place of more productive conversations instead of getting hung up on, inflammatory buzzwords, essentially, which is where some of these conversations kind of start and end.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that came to mind is that working to see businesses as systems. And one thing I should call out is I think systems thinking is really critical in this work.
Yeah.
So you see process, you see the complexity, but you also see like leverage points and root causes of problems to address. Because I think if you don't do that, it's easy to focus on the wrong things.
Absolutely. That was in college. I had a minor that was a cross functional program between the College of Business and College of Engineering. And one of the most valuable things that I learned from my years in that program was the value of systems thinking and to take it from an analytical approach and not just from purely financial approach.
Yeah, so few people would get formal training in systems thinking. I think you're ahead of the game.
Yeah, it was a absolutely phenomenal program. Yeah, they took a couple dozen kids from the College of Business and a couple dozen from the College of Engineering each year and threw us together. All the business kids had to take 2 years of engineering coursework and vice versa for the engineering students. And then we had joint classes together that were kind of like MBA style. And that was where I got my introduction to systems learning at 19, and I've been hooked ever since.
So my name is Artbooked.
Yes. So, one of the things that I wanted to chat with you about is that Climate Positive is a certified B Corporation, which is not an easy undertaking, and that you are publicly committed to net zero by 2030. So, can you talk about what that journey looked like? Because you kind of spoke about being almost an accidental entrepreneur where the work kind of presented itself and then the kind of company idea came after you're like, oh, hey, here's an opportunity, here's a company. So how do you go from that place to a place where you are actually structured as a certified B Corp and making these kind of public pledges?
Well, we had some time to adjust because the launching of the business, the B Corp standard was almost like 10 years after sort of launching the business. So there is a little history in between, but you're right. So the B Corporation community came out with this net zero by 2030 pledge. This was announced at the COP, those international climate conferences. One of them just finished in Brazil in 2019. It's changed somewhat, but sort of the ambition is sort of still there. And so we're committed to that as, we see it's the right path to be on. That comes with some caveats for us. And this may actually sound like heresy to those who understand emission targets and who now know that we're an advisor on these targets, but I'll keep talking anyway. The first part of this is that to remember, and when you're thinking about kind of these reduction targets and capping emissions and trying to get emissions to reduce, is we need climate solutions to scale. So those of us who are providing products and services that help improve the climate crisis should not have their operations capped. And the way these targets frequently manifest is that they cap the amount of operational emissions that are allowed. And so I would put ourselves in a climate solutions category. The other thing that those targets frequently don't recognize is those who are already exhibiting excellent performance. And not to get too far into sort of the philosophy of this, but the approach that is generally taken in kind of in these net zero, science-based targets is that you look at a baseline year, so that could be 2020, 2024, whatever it is. You do your baseline emissions, so you account for your emissions, and then that's the number you have to reduce. There are other approaches though that you could look at, and so for example, if we had a set of similar companies, we could actually look at their performance, like who's producing the amount of products or the generating the amount of revenue for a given amount of carbon. And if you're producing twice as much goods or twice as much value for the same amount of carbon, you shouldn't be penalized as someone who's essentially a low performer, right? So in our case, our operational footprint is already quite low. And what I know is it's really through our services that we can have real impact. Like if I take one of my clients and get them to improve their footprint 5%, that's going to dwarf, my entire value chain. So it doesn't make sense to me to put forth a great amount of effort into reducing what's an already pretty minimal footprint.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah. But that said, though, we do want to be intentional about our impact. And I think there's ways to exhibit integrity around net zero by 2030, even if I don't say we're taking our footprint from 2022 and dramatically sort of cutting that. And as we were just talking about, so, business travel tends to be a large part of the footprint. So we are judicious about, when we step onto a plane, in leveraging that travel to do as much as we can. And then also, just from a practical standpoint, use ground transport as much as possible. So if we, I guess, have a sort of a de facto policy that if you can get to a destination by ground within 8 hours, that's the travel option you should use.
Okay.
And then I mentioned,
That's a nice example of a very easy, actionable policy.
yeah. And I think I sort of got the idea from a colleague who works with a university that sort of set that. And, they're in Europe, so they have a lot within, 6 or 8 hours of train. There's a lot that they can do. But even in places in the
The
US,
trains.
yeah. And then I was also talking about purchases before, so I think I was sort of touching on, be intentional about who you're sourcing from and who are your suppliers, and what standards do they have? Are they already, using renewable energy? Incorporating regenerative farming if you're buying food or any part of the farm supply chain, and just local options for the things that we buy. So we're really focused on sort of maintaining excellent performance. Essentially, when it comes to 2030, we can also look at investing in specialized carbon offsets to really sort of address the remainder, if that's part of the broader climate strategy too.
Can you explain for listeners who might not be familiar with the idea of purchasing carbon offsets? Can you just explain what that means?
Sure. So I've been talking a lot about operations and value chain. Carbon offsets would be projects outside of your operations where you give that project money so you can claim some of the carbon benefits that it claims that are generated. So you can go to different registries and, websites now from, hundreds of suppliers at this point who have processes around deforestation projects and, kind of destruction of quote unquote super pollutants like, methane or certain refrigerants, or developing renewable energy projects, whether in the US or overseas. You can give money to those. One thing that's important to note is, so science-based targets does not allow you to use offsets to get credit for your emissions. But if you, outside of a science-based target, if you have sort of a broader like carbon neutral goal or climate neutral goal, frequently the way you get neutrality is like counting your emissions and then investing in offsets. So that's what I mean by offsets. And there is a very specialized type of, I'll call them a specialized type of offsets. Others might maybe disagree about this, but it's sort of the area of carbon removal. So rather than look at, growing trees or investing in renewable energy that will have future benefits, and so you're avoiding future emissions, carbon removals are actually drawing carbon out of the air now. So there are engineered systems that do this. If you've heard of direct air capture, is one called DAC, where they're these sort of highly engineered ways to try to absorb CO2 out of the air. I think the best expression of those are still, kind of plant and tree based, and then you're taking that carbon and fixing it, like making biochar. If you're familiar with what biochar is, and there are others that are more in like. One company is called Charm Industrial. And so they take plant matter and they convert it to what they call sort of a bio oil. And then the oil they're pumping back down to sort of like reverse the oil refining process. It's like,
That's
okay,
fascinating.
we're recreating the oil and putting it back underground where we need that carbon to go. So they're kind of in this bucket of carbon removal because you can literally measure like how much carbon was drawn out of the air. Trees are similar, but that's sort of more longitude. Like after 20 or 40 years,
Right.
and some trees will grow faster than that, but you can see you have some sort of carbon drawn out of the air. But that's what sort of the carbon removal would be.
Thank you for explaining that. I think, we've given people a lot to think about in terms of their actual operations, then their supply chain, and then kind of this added space that you can kind of play in with carbon removal and purchasing in terms of kind of like your overall strategy of kind of the impact that you want your company to have on the environment, that there is a multi-layered or Swiss cheese, if you will, approach, and you can kind of pick the layers that are appropriate for your business. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing, but there is something that all of us could do.
And the way we talk about it sort of in climate specifically is you have this broader climate strategy that probably should incorporate science-based targets, but science-based targets don't have to be the whole thing. So while you're sort of making progress, you can invest in carbon offsets, engage different stakeholders. You can even have sort of a philanthropic portion of it where you're kind of help investing in different communities to help projects kind of move forward there too. It's kind of really this more holistic, I think, lens that you're sort of pointing to.
Absolutely. So, one thing that stuck out to me as I was prepping for this episode is I came across a quote from you where you talk about a world that is thriving, equitable, and just, not just environmentally sustainable. So, how do you help companies connect climate action to social equity and economic justice? And can you share an example where maybe these three elements really reinforced each other?
Yes, so that's actually from our website and sort of part of the broad vision that we put out, that part of our activity and what we want to do is make that bring that into being.
I love
So
your face lit up when I when I said that, so I can't wait to hear your
yeah.
answer.
So we do have commitments to climate justice. And because of that, we really had to think through how that manifests for our business. And what we determined with kind of this a lot of our work actually does revolve around kind of that measurement piece. I mentioned this three-part process where we measure, we help set targets, and then get a plan together to hit the target. Measurement's a big piece of it. And I realized with internal accounting, there is no aspect of climate justice really. This is kind of an internal accounting exercise for companies. They're just looking at their own operations, they're gathering data, but it's not really touching external communities. And I guess the way I think about climate justice and EJ, and I know you know a lot about EJ, it's inherently place-based, right? So you
Yes,
have people in a place who did not contribute to a problem, but then they're bearing the negative impacts of that problem. And
absolutely.
so climate justice ends up being just kind of a subset to me of like sort of broader environmental justice. So where I think climate justice really becomes relevant is when you're implementing actions, because then you're actually making things happen in the external world that are place-based. So we were just talking about carbon offsets. So if part of your broader strategy and one of the actions you're going to take is investing in carbon offsets, you can look for projects that create this multiplicity of benefits. And so one of the offset providers that I typically look to is a company called Native. They also happen to be a B Corp, but they've also been in this game for over 20 years. And so one of their recent projects was working with farmers in Mexico to install biodigesters, which basically take organic waste, manure, in this case for farms, and you're able to create renewable energy. It's like rather than natural gas from fossil sources, you're creating a gas to burn.
Ah,
So the funding for the offsets is like gap funding, so they can actually invest in these. It helps reduce their energy costs because they don't have to buy diesel or propane or whatever
yeah.
the fuel is. But then you're supporting like small scale farms in Mexico.
Right.
And so if you're someone, particularly if you're someone who's sourcing from Mexico, that's a pretty good story, right? It's like, we're
Yeah.
sourcing from this area, and the projects that are part of our broader strategy are actually like helping improve kind of communities and their livelihood and sort of quality of life. Digesters, I think I found we had a project revolving around this. They also like control like odor issues and kind of some other, some of the problems that happen with manure. So you could get kind of this cross section of benefits that come with it for investing in that.
Yeah, and people don't realize that that part of livestock production is one of the significant drivers of livestock-related carbon emissions. So, yeah, there's huge potential there for wide-reaching impact.
Yeah, exactly. And even beyond like offsets like that, if you are looking at installing solar on one of your facilities, you can offer some community engagement around those place-based projects. And, looking, are there ways to drive community benefit? Are there any potential harms from this project? It's really just adding a little more process around these projects to see if there's other benefits you can create. And I know a lot of times, companies, they have kind of timelines, tight budget, adding more process can feel like a headache. But I think if it avoids like blowback or like community concern about a project, ultimately you're going to be better served by addressing the concern early rather than have it come up later and have to fight lawsuits or whatever else the issues might
Yeah,
be.
that's very, very true. So, we have talked about a lot of different ways that small and mid-sized businesses can implement different strategies. And if I had to try to think of like the top three that you've mentioned, I know that the first is being judicious about travel and then like looking at your value chain. Is there another recommendation that you would kind of round out as your top three strategies you'd recommend for small to medium-sized businesses?
Well, what we would generally recommend for some of the larger companies is renewable energy procurement. So you can do that as a smaller business. A few of the other actions that come up might be sort of less relevant, like recycled content packaging is one that comes up. So I imagine for any product company, certainly that's valid, but others maybe less so. Trying to avoid air freight. And that's something a lot of us can do. Basically, every time you try to do FedEx Express versus ground, you're going to incur kind of more footprint that. So even in sort of smaller ways, not necessarily your own travel, I think there's ways to think about sort of avoiding air freight.
It's a great one. Yeah, and I love that we are leaving people with so many actionable steps that they can take regardless of the size of their organization. And one that we did not mention, even though we talked about your book in the beginning, but they could also grab a copy of your book and check it out. That is also an actionable step that people could take. So, as we are kind of wrapping things up, what is the one piece of advice you wish you could give to every purpose driven founder who's overwhelmed by just the sheer complexity and magnanimity of climate action? What would you want to share with them in kind of closing?
First, I will certainly definitely answer that. Just one thing we actually probably should talk about because it is important and kind of coming up as sort of an emerging action is also shifting where your money lives.
Yes.
So if
Thank you for
you're
flagging that.
yeah, if you have whether it's your 401 you were talking about 401k before, so it sounds like you
Yes.
actually explored this, but like wherever you have your savings, checkings, accounts, even credit cards, look at that bank and look at their performance. A lot of larger banks are involved with, investing in kind of fossil fuel industry in a way in a way that most smaller banks and credit unions are not.
Yes.
You can
That's
also
huge.
yeah, and you can also find more sustainability-oriented banks, like there's Climate First Bank in Florida, there's Beneficial State Bank in California, there's Amalgamated Bank on the East Coast, and so there's options to sort of kind of look at if you wanna feel better about where your money's living.
Yes, and our shameless plugs there because we actually do some of our banking with a bank that is a benefit corp, and people don't realize that there are B Corp and I interchanged benefit corp and B Corp, but there are banks that are both. And so that is an excellent suggestion to look at your local credit union, look for B Corp banks or some of the banks that David mentioned. And for business owners here in Illinois, we are actually required after you have a certain number of employees that we have to offer a retirement plan. And that's why we decided to partner with Just Futures for our retirement plan so that we can make sure that our money, both where it's sitting, where we're parking that money, and when we're doing our purchasing, making sure that it's going to values aligned places because that really helps to build out this kind of regenerative economy. And that cycle is more powerful than a lot of individual actions in and of themselves. So thank you so much. I think that was a perfect gem to land on.
I think that was close to answering your question about the piece of advice, but I think the advice, actually, I think the core advice that I would offer, I don't know if I can do one, but how about two parts?
I don't
Yeah.
think there's ever too much advice.
Okay.
So yeah, feel free.
Well, something that's bite-sized, though, that you can take away and not like a 10-page treatise. I think it could be helpful.
Right.
First, I just say put some effort into understanding your baseline emissions. The second part is to put more effort into crafting climate action plan to which you will commit to implement and drive significant emission reductions. These are targets that the rest of society and the broader globe needs us to set. That's why we're in business, to help enable this. And it's really heartening to see the huge community of companies that has been committed to this and has stayed committed because they're seeing the business value. We are hearing a lot about retraction because of pushback on ESG and sort of the greenwashing, like you were pointing to earlier, Rachel. But from our lens, for the companies that are actually seeing the business value in this, they have not changed, because why are they going to leave business value on the table? They're not doing things simply because there was a regulation in place or they have, some perceived, kind of public risk. Taking those public risks, and like any risks, I think, into account is valid, but it's more about finding ways to work around them because kind of the goal and you're clear about that.
I love that advice. One of the things that I think everyone around me gets tired of me saying is that you can't fix what you don't measure. And we spend so much time with clients on both the financial side and operational side on, first getting clear on what their values are and then saying, how can we objectively measure whether or not you're operating in alignment with those values? And this absolutely fits into that category. So I love that as kind of the starting point, that if you're not measuring anything, you can't make any meaningful goals about where to go to next, or really be intentional about reducing your carbon footprint.
Absolutely. And also, as someone who makes a living off of doing a lot of measurement, I will also say it's easy to measure the wrong things and put a lot of effort into measuring the wrong things. So just be judicious about focusing on the right places and kind of the amount of effort that kind of goes into it.
Do you want to elaborate on what some of those kind of common wrong things are?
Well, I think it's more of, ultimately the goal here should be to inform your strategy, not measurement of its own sake. So the question is, do we need to get things right to 2 or 3 decimal places? If you're looking at financial data, literally 2 decimal places is what you get. But for these other measurements, no. It's like you want to get information that's quality enough to drive good decision making.
Yes.
So there's some subjectivity about how much effort goes into that, but a broad scan to understand where your big impacts are, and then focusing on those big impacts makes a lot of sense versus, grinding away and putting, tens or hundreds of hours into like refining data, but it's not really, if it doesn't change like your action or decision making, that's sort of the real metric to say, I think we're good enough for now. Next year, maybe we'll try to improve it through this, but let's just move forward.
Absolutely. That entire answer made my data-obsessed heart sing, because that is the line that we are constantly trying to find.
Great. I am here for supporting data hearts. So
Love that. And for our listeners, if today's conversation, sparked something for you, whether it's curiosity about your own company's carbon footprint or a desire to turn climate commitments into concrete action, David's book, Climate Positive Business, is an incredible resource. You can also connect with David and his team at Climate Positive to explore carbon footprint analysis and strategic climate planning for your business. We'll have the links in the show notes to the website and to David's LinkedIn. And as always, if this conversation resonated with you, here's what you can do. Subscribe to The Purpose Profit Shift wherever you listen to podcasts. We've got episodes dropping regularly with more visionary founders and change makers who are reshaping how business gets done. And if you found value in today's episode, please leave us a rating and review. It helps other values-driven leaders find us. Until next time, keep leading with intention, scaling responsibly, and building businesses that matter. I'm Rachel Bernier Green, and this is The Purpose Profit Shift.